Tonight on Nation to Nation, remember when Hannah Martin told off Prime Minister Trudeau at a House of Commons event, telling him that corporations are raping the land? The young Mik'maw woman says that's just the beginning of her activist career.
I'm never going to stop, and I made that promise to the land, I would say a long time ago, in that I will keep doing whatever I can to protect it at all costs.
High food prices in the North means eating healthy is nearly impossible. Nutrition North was supposed to reduce those costs, but a University of Toronto researcher found just the opposite.
The rates are rising despite the presence of this program that is supposed to make food more affordable and accessible for the people living in those communities.
I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The debate around resource development continues to pit communities against each other, sometimes even though they are on different sides of the country. Meanwhile, the Liberal government says it wants to be a leader in climate change, despite buying a pipeline from Kinder Morgan for billions of dollars. Our first guest believes her people and territories' rights have been mistreated. And in fact, she said as much to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau last month here in Ottawa during the Daughters of the Vote event. Hannah Martin is Mik'maw and accused Trudeau of violating Indigenous sovereignty. Here's what she had to say.
You cannot be a feminist if you are allowing corporations to rape the land, because as Indigenous peoples, that is our mother. That is not a myth, that is not a legend, that is not a belief, that is fact, that is truth to us. She is our mother. And so when you are allowing corporations to rape the land, you are allowing the continued violence against us, the Indigenous women who are protecting a sovereign nation, sovereign nations from coast to coast to coast.
Ms. Martin now joins us in studio. Thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me.
Now, there are about 340 people at that Daughters for the Vote event, but that clip we just played really stood out. I mean, what was it like standing up and basically pointing your finger at Trudeau and saying, you know, you wear no clothes?
For sure. Well, it was a very unexpected opportunity. It was really something that I wasn't really prepared formally for. And when I've had conversations with some of my colleagues and friends about that moment, I really feel like, even though I didn't prepare formally for it, I have been preparing throughout my undergrad with the kind of work I've been doing as an Indigenous Studies student. So I kind of tell my friends, you know, as an Indigenous Studies student, every day we kind of discuss this idea of, if you had the opportunity to do something like this and address an issue with that kind of power and weight, what would you say to a leader? And so I think informally I have been preparing for a moment like that, but it was definitely an overwhelming experience, especially for a young emerging activist and professional like myself. So it was a great opportunity.
You must have had some butterflies, right?
I definitely did. But I think a lot of my mentors and my elders talk about different prophecies of the young people finding their voice again. And in that moment, I really did feel the power of generations behind me coming out through that speech. So.
Now, you talked about, for several minutes, particularly about Alton Gas.
Sure.
How do you think your rights are being violated?
I think our rights, our collective and individual rights, are being violated through that case because adequate consultation is not happening with Mi'kmaq treaty rights holders. And I think that's what the conversation needs to be about now, is consultation with those rights holders, because we can have organizations representing us, and that's fine. But I think when those organizations and the government as well aren't doing their respective duties to consult adequately with us, the people on the ground who are living these realities on a day-to-day basis and see them in our backyards, I think that's where the problem lies. And I think we as Mi'kmaq people have a responsibility to make sure that happens, as well as the government does. I feel that very strongly. So.
Of course, that clip we just played got a lot of heat on social media.
It did.
What's been the reaction, I guess, since then?
I think things have kind of calmed down in the last few weeks, but I'm definitely still getting a lot of positive feedback, and I was really surprised. As Indigenous peoples, we always say don't read the comment section, but really I did read a lot of comments, and I would say that the majority of the feedback was really positive. And the really powerful thing to me is that there's also a lot of, as we know as Indigenous peoples, a lot of internal politics within our communities, from the Indian Act chief and council to the traditional leaders and the hereditary leaders, the grassroots grandmothers, the youth, and the elders. We all have different, different ways of approaching these issues. But what I found very powerful was that folks from all these different kind of groups within my nation reached out to me and with gratitude for what I said on behalf of our people. So it was a testament to the fact that we can move forward in a way that, in a collective way as Indigenous peoples, even though we may not always have the same perspective or approach on something, because those politics do exist in our communities. There's no denying that.
That's for sure. Yeah. And soon after you did this, you were at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. Can you tell me a bit more about what you did down there? For sure. So that started last year in terms of the youth going to the United Nations from my territory. So two Grand Chiefs of the Wabanaki Confederacy in my territory brought a group of us last year. So Grand Chief Ron Tremblay of the Wolastoqey Nation and Chief Hugh Akaji from the Passamaquoddy Nation. So these two chiefs, as well as our grandmother Alma Brooks, organized to bring a group of youth with them to the UN. They had been going for many years previous to that. But again, referring back to those prophecies of the young people finding their voices and bringing the strength of our ancestors once again, they realized that it was time to start mentoring some of us youth. And so last year I attended as well. And I had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to attend again this year with them. So there was a mix of elders, youth, a grandmother, and also allies that came with us. So we spent about 5 days there helping to draft interventions that would be presented on the floor, and which we presented collectively through the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, which I'm now a North American focal point for, as well as the... Well, congratulations.
Thank you. A big role for sure. As well as the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus, which is more of a wider collective. It's mainly made up of the elders and the older folks in our communities that are there to lobby for our rights. So, yeah.
Well, you've mentioned your elders and your
Yes.
grandmothers, and obviously they must have passed on a lot of traditional knowledge to you.
Yes.
So how can that be used to protect sovereignty, especially when we're talking about the threats from resource development?
For sure. I think this year's theme at the United Nations was traditional knowledge, actually, and the generation, transmission, and protection of that knowledge. And so myself and my friend and colleague, Justice Grubin, we worked a lot while we were at the United Nations on the intervention specifically on traditional knowledge. And a lot of our contributions to that intervention had to do with the fact that you can't address the protection, transmission, or generation of traditional knowledge without protecting our lands, territories, and resources. And so I think, again, the conversation around nation-to-nation relationships has to come back to the land, because for us, our knowledge is within the language, and the language is intertwined with the land. And we can't practice our traditions and our ceremonies, our language, and our ways of life and being without access to that land. So it's hard to have that conversation if we don't address the fact that we do have territories that are unceded, and how do we address that, and how is the government also doing their part in returning those lands to Indigenous peoples? I think that has to be at the very heart and spirit of the conversation around nation-to-nation relationships, is returning that land, because everything else is inherently connected to the land. So. Do
you think that's, of course, you are at McMaster University and you're quite involved in Indigenous rights. Do you think that's going to be the focal point of what you do going forward? Is advocating on returning the land?
I think it's going to have a really big part in it. I think, again, every conversation that we have does come back to that. So I think I'm graduating in June, actually, from the Honors Indigenous Studies program at McMaster. And I think the two emerging themes or focuses for me over the past 4 years within that department have been the environment as well as governance. And so how can we look at a future, a self-determining and sovereign future for Indigenous nations with the environmental context, because I think now we're at the point too where everyone is realizing that it's not just Indigenous peoples who are facing the issues that we faced for 500 plus years of colonialism, but now people, non-Indigenous peoples, are starting to face very similar issues. And so capitalism is not really discriminating at this point anymore, and there's more of a privileged few who don't feel the direct effects of climate change, water quality, and inaccessibility to land. So I think everything that I advocate and do going forward will come back to that, those two areas, yeah.
And I guess finally, do you think the Prime Minister got your message, or you got to still keep hammering away at the politicians?
I definitely plan to keep advocating and being present within those spaces. I think it's a space that, especially us as Indigenous women, we've been absent from for many years. And so I think I'm not going to give up, and that's been really my motto lately is remaining optimistic and continuing to put myself in those places and spaces because I do have a right to them. And also just, I mean, this week too, back in Mik'maw territory, we have a lot of threats now with gold mining. And so just yesterday we found out that a second gold mine is being proposed at the St. Mary's River the St. Mary's River, which the St. Mary's River Association is actively resisting. And so moments like that can feel very heavy on the heart, knowing how hard that we've worked to protect our lands, and then to have another corporation try to move in. But I just said to a friend of mine today, no matter what happens, even if the mines come, even if the Alton gas comes and dumps the brine into the water, no matter what, I know that part of my life purpose is to protect. And so no matter how bad it gets, I'm never going to stop. And I made that promise to the land, I would say a long time ago, in that I will keep doing whatever I can to protect it at all costs, no matter how bad it gets, because that's our responsibility. So. Well,
I'm sure then, if that's the case, our paths will cross once again, and I'll have an opportunity to talk to you again.
I hope so.
But thank you for talking to me now.
It was an honor. Thank you, Todd.
We'll have more after a short break. Welcome back. It's no secret feeding a family in Nunavut is trying at best. Food prices for basic necessities are several times what they are down south. A federal government subsidy program called Nutrition North was put in place in 2011. Researchers at the University of Toronto just released a new study, and it concluded food insecurity had gotten worse under Nutrition North. For example, 46% of Nunavut households experienced food insecurity in 2016, up from 33% in 2011. To talk more about it, I'm joined by the lead author of the study, Andréane Fafard St. Germain. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Ms. Fafard St. Germain.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, just to remind our viewers, what was Nutrition North supposed to do?
Oh, so Nutrition North is a subsidy that is intended to reduce the cost of perishable nutritious food in isolated northern communities across Canada. And its intention is that by making food a bit more affordable, more people can access perishable nutritious food.
Now, you decided to look at 10 Nunavut communities and do a study about what they experienced under this program. What was your major finding?
So what we found is that the rates of food insecurity were high in those communities before Nutrition North was implemented, but they are even higher now that Nutrition North is in place. And so we can't say that the rates are higher because of Nutrition North, but what we can say is that the rates are rising despite the presence of this program that is supposed to make food more affordable and accessible for the people living in those communities.
What was the major disconnect between what you found and what the federal government reports on?
So the federal government typically reports on the cost of the revised Northern Food Basket. So it's a set of items that they monitor the cost in those communities on. And then they reported that after Nutrition North was implemented, the cost of that basket went down. Another statistic that they report on is the volume of food that is shipped to those communities. And what they see is that there's an increase in the volume of food that is shipped since Nutrition North is in place. And what we found is that it goes quite against that, right? So we don't see that more people are able to afford and access food. We see the opposite. So even though more food is supposed to be being shipped to those communities, we see more and more people telling us that they can't put food on their table because they don't have the money for it.
I suppose, what can you conclude from that kind of a disparity?
Well, so we can't really, no, we don't have the data to really explore that more in detail, but for us, it tells us that maybe what we're proposing is that maybe there's a specific segment of the population in those communities that is able to access the food while another segment of the population isn't able to. So is it possible that people with lower income that are more economically disadvantaged are the ones that are less and less able to afford the food, while those that have better employment, better income are the ones that are consuming more fruits and vegetables in those communities, and that's why more food is being shipped there. So in a sense, we are asking through this study is it possible that only a specific people in those communities are benefiting from the program, or are benefiting the most from the program?
I suppose it wasn't part of your study, and I suppose it may be too early to conclude that Nutrition North is a failure and something else should be put in place?
Well, yes, I think, I think we need a lot more data or more research to determine the full impact of Nutrition North. This was a first step in trying to see how does Nutrition North impacts or how it relates to people's ability to put food on their table. There's a lot more questions I think that needs to be answered. I think what the study really questioned, though, is whether it is successful. I think seeing rising rates of food insecurity in those communities, it kind of begs the question, like, maybe it's not really working for the people in those communities. And I hope that seeing those high rates of food insecurity as well, with 46% in 2016, that we start thinking of what is the next step? Now we have Nutrition North. What's the next step? What kind of actions do we need to really have a meaningful impact on reducing those rates of food insecurity? So going beyond Nutrition North or beyond a food subsidy, what is needed in those communities to reduce the rates of food insecurity in a way that is sustainable and meaningful?
Of course, you ended your study at 2016. It's now 2019. I suppose, I guess we can't say whether it's gotten better or worse in those 3 years.
Yes, it's the data will take a little bit of time to be out. And, for us, I think we hope that the government or other people also take up this issue of trying to monitor food insecurity more closely and more rapidly than what we can as researchers down in Toronto. Because there is a lag between the data that is available and the current time. So you're right, we don't know what has happened in the last couple of years.
And I think you freely admitted in some of the media reports that I've seen that Inuit hunting practices or lack thereof wasn't considered when looking into this.
That's right. So the data set that we use doesn't ask any question about traditional food, whether or not people are able to access it. And the measurement of food insecurity that we use also doesn't ask question about this. It's very specific about asking people whether or not they're lacking the money to access food, but it doesn't ask specifically about country foods. So that's one of the limitations, that it's not capturing all dimension of food security for Inuit families in those communities.
And again, I mentioned earlier that the study looked at 10 communities, which is under half of how many communities are in Nunavut. Would you say the conclusions you came at could be spread across all those communities?
Well, I think, if anything, this is an underestimate of food insecurity in Nunavut as a whole. I think if we were to include all communities, we would probably have higher rates of food insecurity based on the past Inuit health survey that shows much higher rates of food insecurity and was more comprehensive in including more communities than what we have. So I think if we were able to include more communities, we would find higher rates. That would be my hypothesis if I had to make one.
And finally, I suppose, how can the feds make the program work better, you think, in your opinion?
Well, a lot of people have already made recommendations of how to improve it and made criticism of what needed to change. For me, I think I would leave it to that because they know better what people are asking for, and community members know better how the program could be improved than I do. For me, what really I hope that people take away from this study is maybe it's time to start looking at a better outcome to evaluate the impact of nutrition in North Canada on the long term, instead of using those statistics of food shipment or the cost of a specific food of basket. What about using an actual measure of people's ability to put food on their table to really see if it's impacting people's life in a meaningful way? So instead of suggesting how to improve the program, I would say moving forward, what about using something that is better aligned with people's ability to access food to evaluate the program?
Okay, that sounds good. Ms. Fafard St. Germain, thank you for speaking to me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
We'll have more after another short break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Before we go, here are a few items that may have flown under the radar. First up, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer has been making campaign-style announcements lately. Yesterday he was in Aylmer, Ontario, where he unveiled an action plan against human trafficking. Scheer will update the criminal code using the Palmero Protocol. It's a United Nations agreement to suppress and punish trafficking.
Doing this will make sure that we have among the toughest laws in the world so that prosecutors are able to secure convictions. I will also not tell a survivor that the horror inflicted on them doesn't count because their perpetrator is already serving time for having done it to someone else. We will amend our laws to ensure that human traffickers receive consecutive sentences for each and every one of their crimes, because every life harmed deserves recognition and every individual deserves justice.
Scheer also said he'd end automatic bail for those charged with human trafficking. Shifting over to Gatineau, Quebec, Liberal MP Greg Fergus announced $300,000 in funding there. It'll finish a project called History of Canada, First Peoples Perspectives.
As our Prime Minister had said, no relationship is more important to the Government of Canada than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. And recently, we've put those words into action, and I think this announcement today is certainly a part of that. And we will always continue to work towards reconciliation.
Anita Tanasco is Education Director for the Kitigan-Zibi First Nation. She said she's proud First Nations history is finally being prioritized.
Pour partager leur travail dans l'histoire, pour avoir une opportunité pour les premiers peuples de ce pays de partager nos idées, nos histoires, nos perspectives. C'est vraiment important que les jeunes dans les écoles primaires, secondaires, dans les cégeps, dans les collèges, les universités à ce pays aient les informations qui viennent de les communautés des Premières Nations de partout du Canada.
That's our show for tonight. Next week will be our final episode of the season. But if you missed this one or any other, check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.